Welcome, everybody, to this week's installment of The Punch List, hosted by your favorite nerds over at nerdsonearth.com. I am joined this week with Jaws, and we are going to be talking a little bit about our tabletop games and specifically around the idea of house rules. Jaws, how are you this fine afternoon?
Man, I'm doing great. I'm excited to come talk about this topic because we're getting ready to start a new campaign, and our DM is specifically asking us to bring some house rules to potentially be considered. So,
Oh, so you guys are doing rules by committee.
yeah, everybody gets to propose one, and then we'll kind of vote on them and see how it goes from there. So, I'm curious to see how it's going to work. I think I've been the most invested of the players in terms of doing some research and trying to find some things. And I know our DM has several he wants to bring into to play. So, yeah, pretty excited. And house rules have a long history in D&D.
Yes.
Everybody in tabletop games, everybody kind of tweaks stuff just a little bit. And I know more than once I've assumed something was a rule, and then somebody was like, "It's not in the book," and you're like,
Yeah, you're like,
"We've always played that."
right. Like, what are you doing? Um, yeah, and last week when we talked about our games, you had sort of asked us the question, and we didn't offer a whole lot as far as house rules. But now that I've had a week to prepare, I think I got
Yeah,
some good ones, and I was able to think of ones that we do have that I completely forgot about. So you want to kick us off with a house rule of your own?
all right. So spoiler if you play my game, but this is the rule I think I'm going to propose. At character creation, we're going to use the standard array. Plus, you roll a d8 and you get that many extra points. But one of your stats has to have a negative modifier.
Yes, I
So,
like
so my
that.
idea here is that, like, I like the idea that, like, we're heroes, we're tougher, we're stronger, those kinds of things, smarter, wiser. But I like the role playing part of, like, there's one area that we're just not great at, and I think that'll be a lot of fun to maybe kind of see how we do that in our group and kind of decide. But trying to balance that, right? Like I like house rules where there's a gain, but there's also uh, maybe not a penalty, but something that stretches you in the role playing side.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Usually, when I end up making characters, I usually end up doing that just because, basically, for the same reasons that you mentioned, is not just make them, super great at everything, or even like level stats. I always like to have some peaks and valleys because that helps me
Sure.
kind of get into that role play um, aspect of things. Um,
And I thought about it too. I played around with it a little bit, and like you can make that choice of like you're good at everything, or you're great at one thing, or maybe two things, and then the rest are so so. So like I'm kind of intrigued to see if one if that rule will pass our committee, but two what kind of characters we'll make.
Yeah, that's really good. And to kind of piggyback off that idea, one that I it's not always a rule at my table, but it's a suggestion if I'm a GM. Is whenever, especially with Pathfinder or any system that you have a lot of different types of skills that you might be able to invest in, and even if
Mm-hmm.
it's Dungeons and Dragons, like you could have sort of custom skills like, oh, my character's a baker, they might know about this, but making the players invest at least one of the initial skill points into something that's backstory related. So whether it be a specific knowledge set or a profession or sort of a crafting type thing, something that in the grand scheme of things, it's not gonna help you get through a lot of different types of situations, like you're picking locks or stuff like that. But it does open the door for those things, like you just look at your sheet, you're like, oh yeah, I've got profession baker, and I'm trying to you know steal a bunch of flour or something to complete a quest. Like, would I know the best conditions to store the flour in so it doesn't go bad before we deliver it? Stuff like that. So I always like to, skills and things like that you can usually use as springboards for role play opportunities.
Yeah, my brother in one of our games, he played a hobgoblin chef. And it was amazing how many times like we worked ourselves into circumstances where we had to cook or we had to do something to kind of get out, and it was really cool. And you see that especially in D&D and 5e, the more rules they add, they just did a whole bunch of feats in the latest book. Some of them are very like job kind of related, so I definitely think that could be a huge help.
Yeah, and plus if you have, I love the chef example because it doesn't have to just be food. Like a chef would know so much more, like dealing with stuff under pressure and like trying to coordinating orders coming in and out of a kitchen, stuff like that. So it's more than just the surface level of the skill. And usually players can be really creative in applying that skill towards certain situations.
Yeah, and I think it just like you said, it helps with role playing. Like, all right, if I know these things, how would I use them, and what could I do? And you know, um, our chef maybe made more than one dead body disappear in the stew. So
uh, that's classic. Um, so one house rule, this is sort of just more across the board, but um, I don't like a lot of the micromanagey type stuff that comes with a lot of tabletop games. So, in Pathfinder, you have feats like eschew materials where you don't have to worry about spell components. I just say, don't worry about spell components. I don't really want to track it. Same thing with
yeah,
like tracking ammunition. Like maybe at the beginning of the adventure, like you got 20 arrows, maybe it matters. But I'm going to assume that you're going to collect your arrows. If you drop your weapon or something, you're going to go pick it up. The only times where that's not the case is, I drop my weapon in the middle of a fight. It's like, okay, well, your weapon is there. So once the fight's wrapped up, I assume you go get it. But within that fight, it's not like you just magically have it again. So a lot of that sort of bookkeeping type stuff I like to hand wave. The one that I do like to keep usually is encumbrance, just because it helps kind of ground the players a little bit. Like, hey, you can't just drag this 3,000 pound thing to the nearby town, stuff like that. So, but a lot of that bookkeeping stuff I like to just strip out a lot of it.
well, encumbrance is an interesting one too because you really can get pretty quickly to a place where do I take this gold or do I leave other stuff behind? And
Right.
I I have noticed a lot in my campaigns. One of the first magic items we usually find is a bag of holding, and I think there's a reason for that. But
Yes.
um, I definitely think it's a good challenge, right? To make players really think like it's the most valuable stuff you got because you got to pick now. You can't carry everything.
Yeah, and to sort of go off that point, like even as far as making players like, hey, would I know how much this figurine would be worth? A lot of times like appraisal type things, I sort of just brush that aside. I'm just going to tell you what it is, and up to a certain point of the adventure, I'll have players like, oh, you don't know what that magical item is, but if you have a very competent wizard who's, a lot of those checks and stuff are going to be automatic. I just say, you know what, here's what you got. But again, it's nice to have a little variation of that early on because then the players are like, well, we're in this impossible situation and we have this scroll that we don't know what it does. Maybe I throw all my eggs in that basket and read the scroll, and maybe it'll be something that helps us out, which can create some really cool story opportunity.
Yeah, I think one of the house rules I thought about in our new game was maybe doing away with ritual spells in D&D. Um,
Mm.
so the way it works currently is like they essentially can take 10 minutes and cast a ritual without it costing a spell slot. They tend to almost always it is used, at least in other games I've been in, like on detect magic, identify an object, that kind of stuff.
Hmm.
Man, if you were to really sit down and like take a timeline and pace out your game, a lot of mine would be like 2 minute fights, 30 minutes of sitting around figuring out what something is, 5 minute
Right.
walks, 2 minute fights. And it's just like, I kind of want it, and I think too, I would say like D&D, it's two different, like you can detect magic, but it doesn't necessarily identify the object.
Hmm.
And I kind of would put those in one and say like, all right, so you'll at least know broadly what the object is. Like maybe not if it's cursed and that kind of thing, but if you cast the spell, you get a pretty good idea of what it is. And um, Yeah, it's interesting to kind of work through those.
Yeah, and yeah, the whole spellcasting in general has a lot of avenues that you can kind of do house rules in. I said, I don't care about materials, but I do kind of care about materials because if there's something that requires something uber specific, or like you need a thousand gold of diamond dust and stuff like that, it's like you kind of need, like, I'm gonna push you to have that, or at least spend the money or something to have that kind of on your person. But all your day to day spells that you're using all the time, it's fine that you don't need that. But it's interesting about rituals, because you can't cast that stuff in the middle of a fight per se. But most of the times you win anyways. So it's sort of a niche
Right.
case where you you just, like, players want to cast their stuff, and so
Yeah, yeah.
whatever way that you can kind of facilitate that, I think is important as a GM.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, just again, like weighing that cost, there should be, more than just time. There should be some real consequences of, all right, are you going to use that or no? Or are you going to hold that off for something later? Um, do you bag it for now and go figure it out later? That kind of thing.
Hmm.
I just think that's a wizard casting. And like you said on components, like I think in my current game, about the only component we really track is in 5e for Revivify. It costs you a certain amount of diamond dust.
Yes.
Like we have to keep that around. And for a long time, we just had enough for one, one casting of it. And there was one fight where two of us went down, and it was like, oh no, like um, one of us might not make it out of this thing. So it's interesting to kind of to think about.
Yeah, I think that we had a very similar situation in a dungeon in our Pathfinder game, and they're like, Abe, hey, would we have enough? Would we have enough diamonds to do this? I'm like, I don't know. And they're like, well, we just found a bag of assorted gems, and so I'm like, great, let's roll, see how many diamonds were maybe in there, and
Yeah.
then so it gets them to think like, hey, we have this loot. Gems are usually just money, but in some cases gems are not just money. So it's nice when you kind of leave a little bit of ambiguity to the loot, uh, especially if it comes to like a painting. Like, you don't have to necessarily describe what's in the painting unless it becomes maybe something that might be a little bit more important. So they're like, oh, maybe we could use this painting in sort of a little deal with this noble to kind of get on his good side, and like, would this be something he might be into? So
Right.
yeah, I like doing a lot of that sort of stuff too. Do you do so one thing I was reading a lot about for house rules, and again, this is sort of Pathfinder specific, but there's a whole, especially if you're playing with feats, there's so many feats that players just take because it's like they're so good, and it's like I always want to take these feats. So there was a site that I was on, and they basically compiled a list of all these. They called them like elephant tax feats, where it's just feats
Mm.
that, since everybody takes, rework how they're worded so that people don't waste feats on them, but everybody has access. Things like power attack or like weapon finesse fighting. It's like, make those just standard things that anybody can do it if they hit a certain requirement. So hey, if I have a +1 base attack bonus, I can go ahead and do power attack. It's like, power attack's one of the most, everybody takes it because it's one of the most powerful, and it scales really well even at higher levels. So people just take it and use it. But that way it's like, I don't have to burn a feat with that. There's a list of feats that's like longer than 12 of my arms, and none of them ever get used because everyone just takes power attack and point blank shot and weapon finesse. So I think incorporating some of that, if you're doing any feat based game, is worthwhile to get players to explore and experience some other things instead of, uh, I'm taking power. I got a I got a martial fighter. I'm taking power attack. Um,
Yeah, it's one of those things of there's sort of you can look up a ideal build on any kind of character in most tabletop role playing games, and it just drives me crazy because I kind of just want to be like, man, make your character, like, don't worry about the best,
right.
the stat. There are times, sure, I want a certain feat, but But there are a lot of other times it's like, try something different, or in D&D world, just take the points, boost your scores. Now, I think there's more out there than that. Right, so here's a more controversial one. As I've kind of been reading about house rules, so there's this one that I'm curious what you think as a DM. The DM makes the majority of the non-attack rolls behind the screen, including like players.
So I've heard variations of this, and I waffle a lot back and forth. My gut instinct is I hate it, in the sense that the GM usually has so much that they're worrying about that keeping track of everybody's stats. I think that's probably the main argument is, either you have all their sheets in front of them, which, I mean, honestly, most of the time, like, they'll give me their sheets, but I don't really keep them up. I'll just be like, yep, looks good. So either you have them in front of you ready to roll, or you're asking them what their bonuses all the time with every single roll. So that's sort of against. What I do really like about it, though, is they never know if they pass or fail. And you can, like, you roll a 1, you're like, I know I'm going to fail. You roll a 3, I'm going to fail. So especially when it comes to those middling kind of rolls where it's like, I rolled a 16 on something, especially with like knowledge checks, you can give them some information and they don't know if it's true or not. Same thing with sense motive. Like, sense motive, rolling for sense motive is just, it's ridiculous to me, because exactly the output, and as much as you don't want to, you're going to be metagaming the result of your roll. It's like, well, you don't know anything, but you do know something is up. So I would say that there's a subset of skills that you can apply that to really well. Things like sense motive, even things like perception checks. But again, with D&D, they've kind of incorporated that with passive perception. So that's not really an issue. So I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah. So as a player, there's a part of you, like, you love to roll the dice, right?
Yes.
You want to be in control, but at the same time, like, let's be real. If I roll a 32 on a stealth check, I'm going to behave differently than if I rolled 11 on the same stealth check. And it's like, okay, there's some validity into that. So I don't know about all of them. It'd be interesting if in the virtual tabletop world a lot of us play in, if you could build an app where the player's hitting the button, but the DM's getting the result.
Yes, only.
So it does away with, like you're saying, you don't have to keep track of all the character stuff. It's coming to you, but I don't know. I think there is one place where I really do think it's a great rule on death saves. Right?
Oh, for sure.
Like, I just think it's a place where I know when one of our guys goes down in our game, we're all sort of thinking through, right, how many rolls, how many, what else can we do before we absolutely have to go, save him or her. I just think it would bring a level of tension that's up.
Yeah, I like that actually a lot, especially because D&D has the if you roll a crit or a fail, that drastically change. That goes from, you can go from having 3 saves to having 1 more save and you're done, really, really quickly.
Oh yeah.
So to keep that sort of in initiative order and just kind of pass over it and just be like, oh yeah, so and so's still lying there, and just keeping the act, like, that can create so much good tension. I agree with that. I love that. I would totally incorporate that for sure.
I just think it's one place where it can eliminate metagaming, right? And I think it just would be more realistic. If your buddy goes down, you're not waiting.
Yeah, you're not timing yourself. Be like, oh, I'm okay for another 12 seconds.
I can swing twice more and still make it.
Right.
To cast whatever. I just think there's that one was one that kind of stood out to me as like, yeah, that's a good in between, right? Players still have a lot of autonomy, but when it gets to that point, it's a little more secret. So
Yeah, and I think, I mean, you can see that there's a lot of games, even, Pathfinder Second Edition, that are trying to go more towards that, and it's sort of like an older style, like more original D&D like feel to it, where the GM has more illusion of control over everything.
Yeah.
Obviously, by doing that, you kind of introduce this thing where players may not trust the GM. Like, did you really roll that well for me or that poorly for me? But I mean, at the
Yeah.
same time, there has to be a level of trust between the players and the GM because I've never been a big fan of the sort of antagonistic style where it's like the players trying to beat the GM. As a GM, I think that people should be like you're facilitating the narrative in the sense that you players do stuff and you react and describe the world in what's happening as a reaction to what they're doing. So when they succeed and that when they're having fun, I mean that makes it way more enjoyable for me. That's not to say I'm going to pull punches because it can be enjoyable to crit with a dragon every once in a while, but uh,
Sure.
again, it's just that trade off, and so I can see as a lot of games try to capture that the perfect amount of tension between the GM rolling a bunch of stuff and the players rolling stuff while giving the story breathing room to evolve based on the players not knowing the true results of the dice all the time.
Let's talk. Let's talk about critical hits. Like, how do
Yes.
you play those in your game? Like,
Uh,
like the worst is when you um, get a critical hit. You get your +2 because of your strength, and you roll 2 dice, and you get 2 1s, and you go. So my critical hit does 4 points of damage. Great. Like,
yeah.
I am a big fan of trying to do some stuff to like ratchet up that damage at least. So curious to see how y'all handle it.
Yeah, so we've tried a couple different things. Nowadays, we kind of stick with we adopt a lot of the house rules that the Glass Cannon uses. So ours, we use the critical and fumble deck of cards. So we'll use those, and then we'll do confirm a critical to make sure it's a crit. And even if you roll an at 20 and you don't confirm the crit, you still get exploding dice. So you still kind of get that feel good type of stuff. What we kind of did in the past, we've tried doing things like you roll if you get a crit, you roll max damage, and it's just automatic, and that's fun. It always creates good moments. Um, but I find that I don't know, it's too much damage all the time. I like the damage to be a little more variable, so we kind of took that part out of it. Uh, it's sometimes I don't know. It's kind of hard to do the crits in like an interesting way. Sometimes you can add an extra dice to it instead of just doubling the dice. Maybe you double and add one more dice. That way you're almost guaranteed to get higher than the average to kind of boost it up. Because again, you don't want those situations where you're rolling 4 damage on a crit because that's not fun. So sometimes throwing some extra dice in there is nice for them, or even if it's let's say they're using like a great axe or something that's a D12. Um,
Right.
you could even do it where it's like, hey, if it has to get at, you're gonna do at least if you roll 1 to 3, re-roll that dice, for that just
Gotcha.
to give you something a little bit more. What sorts of stuff do you guys use?
Yeah, much are double your die, like roll the dice twice, then add your mods. And like I said, most of the time that's okay. Sometimes we do get lows. I've seen a rule, and just kind of reading through house rule where somebody says, so like you take your max, then you roll a die, then you add your mod. So, and
I
you're like
was
great axe
Yes,
example.
that's what I was just as you were saying that I was thinking, gosh, why don't you just if you're gonna double it, why don't you just have one that's a max and then you just roll the other one so you're still getting at least half every
Yeah,
single time.
that great axe would do that 12 plus you roll a d12 and then plus your strength or whatever. So and that to me is like, okay, so that's always going to be substantial. Like
Hmm.
even if you roll a 1 on your d12, that's still 13, 14, 15 point. I think there's some interest there. We don't use like crit decks, and I've been curious thinking about. Um, One of the things that's interesting about those is sometimes there's long term injuries, which I think it can be interesting in games. Like you play D&D by the rules, basically, give me an hour and I can recover from anything. So if I
Right.
was seven sword shots to the chest and on death's door, short rest, and if I've got the hit dice, I'm okay.
Yeah,
You know, I'm up and in.
give me a cup of coffee and I'm ready. I'm bouncing back.
Yeah.
Give me some of that cure light. Um, yeah,
So
it's
it makes me, I don't know. I think sometimes games should be a little harder on players. And I say that as player and a DM, you know. Um, Sometimes as a DM, you go, man, you guys, I just threw everything at you and you just bounce back like nothing happened, you know, versus, you know, in those circumstances where a player, like, you should have to make hard choices. Like, you know, are we going to rest here? You know, should a rest take longer? You know, there be tiers. And once you go below half your hit points, rest doesn't work as well.
right.
Something
Yeah,
like that.
and that's an interesting one. And that's something I would love. I would love to do sort of a not like a hyper realistic campaign, but more of like a grim dark style where maybe it's low magic or magic. Magic isn't a cure all type of thing, where a lot of people to sort of incorporate some existing rules will like when you're describing if something hits in combat, right? So you have like your armor AC and then your dex bonus. So you have all these different tiers of like if you roll a 22, my AC is 25, but five of that is due to my armor. Describing that's hitting your armor as opposed to dodging out of the way. So it's still a hit. But incorporating that too with the idea of people think of hit points as like I took one damage, I must be bleeding. But a lot of places I've read, people use that more as like a fatigue type of condition. So it's like,
Yeah.
all right, I have 80 hit points, but like once I hit 50, I'm like winded. There should maybe be a consequence to that, like you know, you take a small penalty to your dex or something, to really incorporate that threshold of like you're not you know your arm's not falling off every single battle. You're not bleeding out every single battle, but battle wears on you, and how do you translate that to the game? And I like that idea of having different sort of thresholds of tiers. So it's like, uh, it adds that tension, that same tension of making death saves, but it widens that window so much wider, so that players have to be like, oh man, he's not looking so good over there. We have to reassess this just glass cannon type approach of just throwing everything at the wall in this battle.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And then just, you know, rest and do it again.
And rest and do it again.
Um,
Um,
as long as same lines, like I think crits, one of the things that you see in a lot of homebrew games is crits will a successful crit will like damage armor, so it's not as effective. I think is an
yes,
interesting.
I like that.
Then crit fails damage your weapons, which I think is makes it a little more of a real cost.
Yeah, damaging weapons is something that's really, same thing with armor, but just damaging items in general is something that just isn't used as much as you think it should. It's like I get the idea that's like you might have a magical sword or something that it should be kind of impervious to that type of thing, depending on how powerful it is. But at the same time, it's like you're going up against giants and like thick hide beasts and like metal armor. Like those weapons would take an absolute beating, and so would your armor if you're taking those kinds of hits. I like the idea of things like a dragon's fire breath weapon applying like a heat metal type effect.
Yeah,
Incorporating
yeah.
some kinds of spells into attacks to make them kind of beef them up and make them more than just a damage. We kind of just talked about it, but damage as a number isn't scary. But when you combine, hey, I'm losing hit points and something else is going on that I now have to react to. I don't have to react to hit point damage until I'm at 20 hit points, But you have to do something
Right.
maybe about my armor's getting so hot that it's literally boiling me alive. I should probably do something about that. So I like things like that, rules if you can find certain, and again, I mean, you can drastically affect the CR of an encounter if you're just incorporating fireball or any old spell into that. But some of these like lower level spells and just like tone them down a little bit. If the damage for like heat metal, I don't know what it is, probably like a D6 eventually. Don't tone it down to a D4 or a D2, something where it's just a little different, but it's that effect that you really want. You don't care about the damage as much.
Right. Yeah. You're just making the player kind of think through what's happening and what's the risk. Is it worth taking? I think that's smart. So, do you guys use inspiration, or sometimes people call them story points?
Yep, we do. We do the inspiration style, bottle cap type of thing. So if players are do an exceptional role play or just have like a really creative turn or something where they thought something through, sometimes I'll even give them, they'll just be having a conversation and they theory crafting and someone gets it right. I'll make a note of that even months ahead of time, and then when it finally comes through, I'll be like, by the way, you're getting a bottle cap for that, for the
Nice.
comment that you made way back then. So we like to do that. We still do it where basically it gives advantage. So same thing as D&D. I haven't. I mean, it is really powerful of an effect, but at the same time, it kind of depends how freely you give them out as GM. If you're not giving them out all the time, I like every player to kind of have one in the hopper most of the time. Because for those big moments, I mean, I love big moments where players are like, cash in this one, cash in, and they're just spending them as currency, as like fake currency, because then it knows that as a GM, I know that I've created a situation, or through their actions they've helped create a situation where the stakes are meaningful. So I think they're a fantastic tool, because then when they work, players get hyped up. When they don't work, the tragedy is so much deeper, because they just scream out into the void that it didn't
Yeah,
work
the
and they
cost.
tried everything.
Yeah, so we mainly play like D&D rule, which is binary, right? You either have inspiration or you don't, and you can't add them up. So,
Yeah,
I think sometimes that's hindered us some. I think if you have a DM that's freely giving them out for great role play and stuff like that, I think you could build. Um, and kind of reading about it too, I've read about tables where they have like players have points, also like the table as a whole has
sure.
story points, like, that they can share and use in different ways. So I take it from, it sounds like from your end, cashing all those bottle caps, those inspiration points before they roll.
Yeah, it's always before the roll, never after. Um, just because, you know, then it's like, hey, if it really means that much to you that you would spend it up front, and not like, oh, I got it on my first roll, so I'm gonna roll again. So I always have
Yeah,
them roll up front. Um,
cool.
and another way that I really like kind of the story points, and it doesn't work as well if you do like shorter sessions. Like we play 2 hours, which is it's short. But
Yeah,
if you were to play like a 4 or 6 hour session, having those be session specific, I really like that idea, because in that period of time, there's going to be opportunities to get it every single session that you're playing. Whereas if you're only playing an hour or two, the odds of it coming up, I mean, it's so small. It's like, well, you got it and didn't get an opportunity to use it, so it's gone.
yeah, it's gone.
So that's no fun. So but I like giving them out. But even in the sense of D&D, if you cap it at zero, if it's capped at one, I think there's opportunity to say let's have it be two or three even, for good stuff, and then just sort of constrain or restrict how, like, what your internal criteria is. I'm not consistent at all. Sometimes the players will say a funny joke and I'll give them one.
Yeah,
But
yeah, no, I totally get you.
so yeah, that's so
Yeah,
that,
I think we're inclined to we're for being get them. I think, like you're saying, we're for being funny. Then every once in a while, we'll have a great role play moment. So my current player is a swashbuckling rogue who happens to used to be in the circus. So like one of my claims to fame is I wrote a song like that, and I personally wrote a real song about Dragon's love story, and it sort of saved our hide at one point. So it's kind of fun. But like I also knew, like I wrote that thinking we got to get out of this, and this will probably get me some inspiration points. So
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's
yeah,
that's the other thing too. If a player comes to me and says like, "Hey, I've got this idea for like a flashback or just this cool thing I want to do," I love that because it's like it's not going to throw me off of any rails. I can work that sort of stuff in flashbacks. You can work in at any point. Even mid
yeah,
battle, if it comes up, they see the reflection in the eye, they see something in the room that reminds them of this thing. Like you can get flashbacks out at any time. So if a player is willing to put forth that effort, dishing out an inspiration or two is a good way to get the other players to be like, I can get that for that sort of stuff. And it makes them want to kind of stretch into the character a little bit more.
yeah, man. Role playing, like characters that'll do that and go deeper in role playing, it just makes the whole thing so rich. I mean, obviously fans of the Glass Cannon podcast, but like some of theirs. So I think about the one Skid did that was about character Jimmer and how he lost his eye.
Oh yeah, it's
It was just so good, and you were just like, he went from being a character that I sort of was okay with to like, that's the dude, like
Yeah,
that's the
yeah,
guy, you know?
exactly. Before that, I wasn't like on board with Jimmer, and I mean, yeah, if you guys haven't listened to it, I mean, a lot of the Glass Cannon, like they all have this just great table presence and different feels. They're great about developing their characters, and they give themselves the freedom in the table to explore those different character angles. And so there's some just really good stuff where it's just it doesn't take you out of the narrative, and obviously they're doing it for a podcast, so it's meant to be a source of entertainment. And people think that it's like, well, I could never do something that good, so I don't even want to. What's the point? I don't want to be compared to that, but
Yeah.
everybody starts somewhere, and if you put in a little 2-minute monologue, and the next person does, suddenly like you just get comfortable in doing that sort of thing, and it, like I said, it puts you in the character's shoes, so that you can kind of it'll help you in the future as you develop that character more and as there's more story that comes out.
Well, and even if it's just like a written piece you send over email, like in
Right.
between games, it just, I think the more it helps everybody understand characters and like see the depth, just think more about their characters. I think the better our games get.
For
I
sure.
think that's a huge.
Yeah, so I mean, that's kind of what I got on house rules. I mean, the only other thing I'd mention is, especially if someone's either playing for the first time, playing a new class for the first time, that whenever there's a new character, those first couple sessions, you don't want to be like tied to a character that is you're like, this isn't really going to work for me.
Yeah.
So I think having like a 3 session sort of cap that's like, all right, within these 3 sessions after you make, you have complete freedom to rewrite, to configure, do whatever you want to your character, to sort of lock them in so that you're happy with something that you're going to play. Nobody wants to be stuck with you're like, well, it's low level. My odds of survival are very slim. And then, 8 months later, here you are with this character that you don't really like that much.
Yeah, actually in Dungeons and Dragons Adventure League's game, the rule is up until I think it's till you cross into fourth level, you can change anything you want about your character. And
I,
so,
I
like,
love that.
I think that's gonna be cool. Like knowing that they use that venue to bring new players in the game. Of like, you're playing a, you know, Goliath barbarian, but now you decide you really want to be a gnome wizard. Great, switch it up.
Right. It's
Make-
it's completely different.
it's
Um,
low level. It's not going to change that much at this spot. So
right.
I think that's kind of fun.
Yes, I agree. You got any others you want to hit us with quick?
Uh, um, there's a lot. If you start reading, there's a lot about initiative. I think that's always interesting. Getting people that are tied, how they decide to go, or that kind of stuff. think that's interesting. A lot of stuff around, what we used to would call race. Now we talk about as ancestry. In D&D now, where they're sort of saying you can play around and move your character's ancestry adjustments to however you want to do, not locked into certain things. I think that's really cool and kind of show the game evolving.
Yes,
some different ways. But yeah, no, I'm really excited we play tonight where we're trying to take down the Frost Maiden. So if we survive that, I think our session next week will be where we're all pitching our rules. So we'll kind of see how that goes. I'll have to come back and give you a report on what we wound up with.
Yeah, well, we'd love to hear it. And maybe I'll probably keep stewing on this, and I may throw you some more ideas in our Discord. But I don't know, maybe somebody else will. If you guys have some ideas out there in Nerds on Earth, feel free to plop them down in the comments and stuff like that. We love to hear house rules. I mean, everybody's table is different, and even as you go from one GM from one table to another, like your games can be so drastically different because players are like, you encounter that one situation and everybody, it ends in a house rule. You're like, this is how we're going to handle it from here on out, and that sort of stuff is really cool. So awesome.
Definitely.
This has been a lot of fun, Jaws. Happy always to talk. I mean, we could talk tabletop for hours and hours and hours. So
Yep.
this was a lot of fun. All right, that'll be it. Thanks for joining us, nerds. Be sure to check out nerdsonearth.com. And again, if you have any house rules, post them down in the comments for us. Otherwise, we'll see you later, nerds.
All right.